Boys and girls, welcome to the Bradbury Group, New Zealand's best weekly political argument, hosted by the militant, Marxist, anti-Santa, Martin Bradbury. The Bradbury Group is streamed live on Rover, Sky TV, YouTube and Facebook. Proudly sponsored by Wātea, journalism you can trust. Let the arguments begin.
Kia ora Aotearoa. The true demarcation of power in a late-stage capitalism, liberal, progressive democracy is the 1% richest plus their 9% enablers versus the 90% rest of us. Welcome to the Bradbury Group, New Zealand's best weekly political argument. I'm your host, the editor of the daily blog, Martin Bradbury. Bomber to my comrades, Mr. Bradbury if you're nasty. My pronouns are us and we. Coming up on this evening's show, the political panel all-stars tonight are Green Party MP and high-ranking Jedi Riccardo Menéndez-March and union boss hardman Michael Wood. Tonight's 1-on-1 and 10 is leader of the Labour Party, Chris Hipkins. Shout out to Kiwi Squirt and Chewy from BHN moderating tonight's YouTube page. Good evening to all the Bradbury Easters online watching right now. Your comments will appear on screen as we go. Shout out to our Wātea Facebook, Rover and Sky TV whānau, and our Twitter panel this evening is Tim Selwyn and Matthew Tukaki. They'll be tweeting live online at Twitter, hashtag the Bradbury Group. Before all that, however, is this week's War on News. Brothers and sisters, this week we had a government refuse to recognise Palestine while reopening oil and gas exploration in New Zealand. So we won't recognise Palestine, but we will recognise oil. How very American of us. What else will this government shock us by recognising? Concede the rights of cancer, acknowledge the Ku Klux Klan, acceptance of flesh-eating zombies, pretending Simeon Brown is a big boy who can run public health into the ground all on his own. This government have a unique knack for recognising the worst of human nature and then pretending that is somehow leadership. Choosing to recognise oil but not Palestine this week was this government at its worst. Talking of pretend leadership, the Prime Minister Chris Luxon sent what he called a sincere letter to Chris Hipkins this week, begging Labour not to dump his inane oil and gas recognition if National loses the next election. Couple of things. One, it's not a great sign of confidence that the PM is reaching out to the leader of the opposition, begging him not to change controversial policy if Labour win the next election. Secondly, Luxon sent the leader straight to the media before Chippy was even able to respond. So it wasn't a sincere gesture of goodwill. It was another political stunt by a desperate government who are fearful voters are turning against them in droves. So not only does sending a letter begging not to overturn stupid and counterproductive environmental policy look weak, it was cheap as well, which, when you think about it, weak and cheap manages to sum up National's environmental credentials. And finally, in this week's War on News, research out from our very own University of Auckland today shows climate leadership is falling short in New Zealand. The study finds current leadership practices insufficient, encouraging small fragmented steps that weaken climate policy. Researchers found that the current government takes a much stronger pro-market approach, signalling that climate adaptation leadership should be devolved to individual homeowners and the market. Auckland University researchers argue that by shifting responsibility onto individual homeowners and insurers, climate leadership has narrowed to protecting property rather than addressing inequalities or broader environmental impacts. Brothers and sisters, we're all going to die on a burning planet thanks to the lies of the petro-industrial complex and their polluter mates. To quote the great warrior poet oracle Mike Hosking, happy days. The political panel all stars up shortly, whānau, but first, this week's 1-on-1 and 10 with the leader of the opposition, Chris Hipkins. Kia ora, comrade. Welcome to the show and thank you for being available to the Fourth Estate. Your democracy is grateful.
Kia ora, Bomber. Great to talk to you.
Oh, sorry. Guys, I can't hear. Well, just a moment, Chippy. If I can't hear the interview, it's not going to work very well.
It could work quite well for me, maybe, but probably not so well for you.
Just a moment.
That good?
Can you say something now?
Can I say something now? Can you hear me now, Bomber?
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Chippy, we need to begin this week with the appalling decision by National, ACT and New Zealand First to not recognise Palestine. Let's start by acknowledging up front that no one on the New Zealand left condones what Hamas did on October the 7th. Many of us understand why Hamas acted the way they did because of the oppressive, brutal occupation, but no one is celebrating that action. What many of us are saying, however, is that despite that attack by Hamas, the disproportionate use of violence by Israel has crossed any threshold of self-defense and has become a war crime, if not a genocide. By refusing to recognise Palestine, this government has put us on the side of those who believe shooting children in the face, using hunger as a weapon, and the vast, appalling sexual assaults of prisoners in detentions is acceptable. We are a country that has made historic firsts. Universal suffrage, the 40-hour working week, nuclear-free. We stand for values of peace, and we have shed blood for those values of freedom, an independent judiciary, the rule of law, and the unalienable rights of the human being. Why has this government betrayed our collective mana in such a grotesque manner?
Well, this is more than a national embarrassment. It's a moment of shame in New Zealand's otherwise proud history of values-based independent foreign policy. Remembering it was Murray McCully, a former National Party Foreign Affairs Minister, who, when New Zealand sat on the UN Security Council, pushed really hard for not only Palestine, the two-state solution, but for the two-state solution to be based on the pre-1967 boundaries.
Yes.
So, that was a very principled position from a national government. And this current government have departed a long, long way from that now. They've basically, in all but given up on the two-state solution. And I think that's just wrong.
The government's argument is that Palestine doesn't meet the benchmark as a state because they haven't held an election and don't control all their territory. Well, the Ukraine doesn't control all of its territory and it can't hold elections either. That hasn't stopped us recognising the Ukraine. Over 66,000 Palestinians are dead, plus 11,000 bodies still trapped under the rubble, plus the 186,000 the Lancet calculates have died from indirect consequences of the war. How are measly mouth semantics about statehood an adult response to possibly 250,000 dead?
I think it was an absolutely shocking representation by Winston Peters on behalf of New Zealand. It didn't live up to our, I think, widely respected reputation internationally as being principled on these kind of matters. But even worse than that, he attacked our friends. So Australia, Canada, the UK, the countries who have recognised Palestine, he basically attacked them for doing so. It just makes New Zealand look terrible internationally.
New Zealand is a small nation with a proud history on the international stage. If we won't call out our allies when they commit atrocities, what's the point of our voice?
Look, there is an unfolding genocide Oh, I'm getting a bit of feedback. There's an unfolding genocide taking place in Palestine. New Zealand needs to be principled in calling that out. We should recognise Palestine. We should do the right thing. We should get on with it.
I'd like to move on, Chippy, to the extraordinary mood of the boardroom results out last week that saw CEOs attack Nicola Willis and Chris Luxon over their handling of the economy and instead, amazingly, ranked Labour's own finance spokesperson Barbara Edmonds over their performances. There is an old saying in New Zealand politics, Labour is good for capitalism, National is good for the capitalists. When you were last in power, Labour built an infrastructure pipeline for roads, hospitals, schools and public housing because the industry warned you that without that pipeline, they would lose workers to Australia. One of the first things National did in government was destroy that infrastructure pipeline. We lost 18,000 jobs in the construction industry and 70,000 Kiwis moved mostly to Australia. You can't just let the free market run rampage and call that an economic policy. What are you going to do about the economy if you win next year?
Well, Nicola Willis's chickens are all coming home to roost now. You look at the early decisions that she made, cancelling, pausing, stopping a whole lot of projects that were underway. Now we're seeing the consequences of that. 20,000 fewer people working in the construction sector today than there were on election day. And the government's played a big part of that. Take the slowdown in the housing market. In the past year, half of the slowdown in the housing market was due to the government pulling out of housing projects. So half the jobs lost in the domestic house building industry in the last year were directly because of the government. You could go through all of the infrastructure areas and you'll find similar examples of that. This isn't a government that's saving money either. Melling Interchange, just down the road from me, a big infrastructure project. Chris Bishop put it on hold when he became the minister because he thought he could get it done cheaper. In the meantime, millions and millions of dollars of extra costs have been racked up while no one's done any work. And now the project's not going to actually be that much cheaper anyway. So it didn't save money, it cost money. Yeah. These guys aren't the financial geniuses they keep telling the country they are. In fact, they're entirely the opposite.
Dr. Eric Crampton from the New Zealand Initiative, hardly a card-carrying member of the Communist Party, has argued Nicola Willis has built in a structural deficit. At what point does the credit ratings agencies start taking notice of this?
Well, the tax cuts that Nicola Willis delivered, not only were they unaffordable, they were inflationary. When the New Zealand Initiative is arguing that the government's tax cuts were working against the Reserve Bank in trying to lower inflation, I mean, the New Zealand Initiative's no friend of the Labor Party here. They were hardly going to be defending our track record, but they were saying that what we said before the election was right, that the tax cuts were unaffordable and that they were going to actually make the Reserve Bank's job of getting inflation down harder. Now the government is saying it's all the Reserve Bank's fault that the economy's not growing fast enough. Remember, one of the very first things they did was change the law to say to the Reserve Bank, it's not your job to grow the economy, it's not your job to get people into work, your only job is to keep inflation low. And they changed the law to make it so. Yeah. And now they're saying the Reserve Bank's holding the economy back because they're not getting people back into work. They changed the law to say that wasn't the Reserve Bank's job.
So if there's an opportunity to win the next election, Chippy, and God willing, that'll happen, what are the kind of things you're going to need to do to bring back that confidence into the New Zealand economy?
I've said jobs, health and homes are our key priorities as an incoming government. Jobs because we've got to get Kiwis back to work. Yes. Government investment in infrastructure is one of the ways that we can do that. But government support for the productive economy is also really important. We've got to stop viewing houses as our default form of investment. Yep. We've got to get investment back into productive businesses that create jobs rather than into the speculative housing market. So you'll see policies from us focused on those things. We need to get back to some basic premise, some of the principles that have made New Zealand successful before. We were successful when we had an abundant supply of cheap electricity driven by fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are no longer cheap, but renewable energy is abundant and cheap. So we do have opportunities here to grow our economy by being competitive with our electricity market. So you'll see more from us in that area. We've got to get New Zealand back to work. New Zealand does not work under national.
Just thinking about Auckland and the infrastructure issues we have here and the debt level of the local council and not being able to go above that, would Labour be interested in looking at using the ACC fund or the super fund to directly invest into New Zealand infrastructure?
One of our problems as a country is that we do actually have quite a big pool of investment through KiwiSaver, ACC, the New Zealand Super Fund, and a lot of it is invested offshore. And then the government's saying we need to bring in overseas capital to solve our problems. Actually, we need to be investing in ourselves. We have the opportunity to back ourselves to solve these problems.
We have to move on to the insane decision to reopen oil and gas exploration. Isn't it true, Chippy, that Shane Jones has more chance of finding a bloody mower than new oil and gas fields? Before Labour's ban, Chevron, Statoil, Petrobras and OMV all handed back their exploration licenses because they found nothing out there. Why does Shane Jones magically think he'll find some this time around? And how on earth does more oil and gas help us on a climate change burned planet?
As a country, we spent over 20 years looking for more oil and gas and didn't find any. The
Right?
government giving them a $200 million subsidy is basically the government pouring $200 million down what is likely to be an empty hole. It's not going to help us. We've got abundant renewable energy, a
Yes.
$200 million investment in helping to transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy, whether that's bringing on stream new forms of renewable energy or supporting the businesses who currently rely on fossil fuels to transition to electricity and other forms of renewable energy. That's going to help us far more than Shane Jones's flight of fancy, doubling down on yesterday's energy technology. Fossil fuels were abundant and cheap 50 years ago. They no longer are now. Even if they found gas now, it's not going to be the cheapest form of energy available to us. There are other cheaper forms of energy available.
I need to wrap on the local elections. Look, because I'm a politics geek, Chippy, I've been banging on about this issue for over a decade. Most Kiwis have no idea that we're such a pack of cheap bastards that we subcontracted out our local elections to two private companies. Now, I've done the research before the privatisation of our local elections. Participation rates in the 1990s were 55%. Almost 3 decades later, under the privatisation model, it's a mere 37%. Surely, to save our local democracy, the government must take back running local elections and run them with the same resource as we run national elections. Surely.
I'm certainly open to the idea of the Electoral Commission running local elections as well as central government elections. We also have to have a really decent conversation as a country about the structure and the nature of local government. What is the role of local government? What's the best structure for it? Councils themselves have been calling for this debate, and the National Party closed the door on it. Actually, I think New Zealanders want to see us tackle this, not in a top-down way, not with central government coming in and saying we're going to restructure it all and we know what's best, but actually in a way that says to communities, how do you want your local government to operate, and how can we best make that happen?
Preach. Finally, Chris, I talk a lot with many brothers and sisters on the left. And there is a real malaise and depression about how bad shit has gotten under this anti-treaty, anti-Māori, anti-worker, anti-renter, anti-beneficiary, anti-disabled and anti-environment government who have strangled the common good for their donors' interests. As the leader of the Labour Party, what is your message to the left-wing whānau as we head into election year?
We can win the next election, but we're going to have to work for it. No one on the left should be looking at the disaster of this government and thinking we can just defeat them because they're that bad. It's going to take more than that. We're going to have to work really hard. One of the reasons that we've been slow to release policy, and we won't see most of our policy until next year, is because we want to get this right. We can't afford 3 more years of this government. It will do so much damage to New Zealand. So yes, we're making sure that we're doing our homework, getting all of the details right, but we're also making sure that we can deliver on what we promise, because there is a real cynicism towards democracy at the moment. And I think we can't afford another government that doesn't deliver on the things that it promises New Zealanders, because democracy around the world is hanging by a thread. And we've got to fight really hard to keep it. And I'm determined to ensure that we restore faith, not just in the role of government, but in democracy itself. And that means we've got to get this right.
Preach. Amen. Thank you, comrade. We look forward to speaking with you soon again.
Good to talk to you, Bomber.
Thanks, mate. Be well. Okay, now to our political panel all-stars. Our first panellist is a Green Party politician and high-ranking Jedi. He's basically Harry Potter with a lightsaber. Spokesperson for Auckland issues, commerce and consumer affairs, associate health, immigration, social development and workforce planning and development. Green Party list MP Riccardo Menéndez-March. Kia ora, comrade. Welcome to the show.
Kia ora, thank you for having me.
One word to describe the week, please, sir.
I think a betrayal. It's a betrayal of our values. It's a betrayal of what people in this country stand for. And I'm referring obviously to the government's choice of not recognizing Palestine, despite Palestine always having existed, despite the fact that you can't take that sovereignty away and those rights away from Palestinians. So yeah, betrayal would be how I would wrap up the the government's decisions this week.
Amen. Really looking forward to getting your words of wisdom on that issue. And last but certainly not least, our other panellist is nicknamed Molotov Cocktail for his militant union tactics and devil-may-care charm. The former Labour Party Cabinet Minister and constant champion for the underdog and the lowest paid workers, Etu's union specialist, the Honourable Michael Wood. Kia ora, comrade. Welcome to the show.
Good to be here.
One word to describe the week, please, sir.
I think the word for the week is spring, because despite the betrayal, despite the attacks on workers and so many people in New Zealand, there is energy pulsing through New Zealand as people come together to resist this crummy government and get ready to build for change next year.
Preach, I love it. Brothers and sisters, let's get into tonight's show. Issue 1, the decision not to recognise Palestine and its ramifications. Issue 2, CEO mood of the boardroom and how bad will the economy get. Issue 3, how stupid is the decision to reopen oil and gas exploration. And issue 4 tonight, local body elections and voter suppression. Plus, we'll have a final word at the end of the show where each panellist gets to go to the mountaintop to see who breaches broadcasting standards. This week, it could be anyone. Comrades, the nation was shocked Friday last week as the government betrayed almost all the things we stand for by refusing to recognise Palestine. I've seen some cruel shit in my 30 years of commentating on politics in this country. What this government decided to do by not recognising Palestine may be the cruelest. Riccardo, how far have we fallen in just 2 years that a New Zealand government would turn its back on people facing genocide to side with those committing the war crimes?
Yeah, I think it's a real betrayal of what we have stood for historically. We've, taken really important stands on injustices in the past, and including, having, as a nation, stood up for being nuclear free, and I think that's really important. But what is critical here is also that the government is taking voters for fools by assuming that voters will buy the rationale that this is about taking an independent foreign policy. If anything, it's just lapping up to the United States and their complicity in supporting this genocide. This is not about us being an independent nation. This is not about being on the wrong side of history, which is what the government has done. We could have done so much more differently. We could have not just recognized Palestinian statehood, but moved to support sanctions on Israel as well. And that is about taking meaningful action towards peace, towards justice, and towards taking a clear stand on a people that are currently facing a genocide. And so, yeah, we stand with the tens of thousands of people across Aotearoa who marched a couple of weeks ago with us, calling for sanctions. And we look forward to marching with them again and use all of the tools we have in Parliament to put pressure on this government.
Follow-up question. The government claim Palestine hasn't reached the threshold of a state. But with over 66,000 dead, 11,000 trapped under the rubble, 186,000 dead from indirect war violence, they have reached the threshold for genocide. Is this a shameful day in New Zealand history?
I mean, it is. And I think, to me, the rationale that we've been giving just doesn't stack up. You could apply some of the rationale they've given us to other nations as well. More importantly, this is about a government that is refusing to acknowledge the necessary steps that we need to work towards to ensure that there's justice and peace. Without Israel facing any genuine consequences,
right,
they will absolutely not be feeling the heat over the genocide that they're committing. Words at the UN won't cut it at this point, and less so when our government is taking sides with nations that are complicit in supporting a genocide. Once again, this is not about an independent foreign policy. It's about taking sides with the oppressor.
Michael, I don't even know what to say anymore, mate. The list of horrific things the Israeli military systematically do to psychologically break Palestinians reads like a horror script. How on earth are we on the side of those who bomb civilians in tents and who have killed over 237 journalists?
If you have a shred of humanity and decency or the most minor regard for international law, then the thing is that recognition of Palestine is actually just the bare minimum.
It's the least
at this point.
Right, it's the least we could have done.
It is the least, and you look at those shaded in maps which are doing the rounds at the moment, and we are now one of a tiny number of countries which haven't taken this minimal step, let alone taking the necessary steps of naming and taking action against self-confessed war crimes, an unfolding genocide, and the concrete sanctions that are needed to actually put some material pressure on what is now a rogue state, in my view.
It has reached pariah levels, hasn't it?
We haven't even reached this utterly minimal level. The one area I've got a slightly different take from Riccardo on is I'm not so sure that the motivations of this government are externally focused in terms of aligning with the United States.
Okay.
My take is that the toxic mix of characters that you have in this government, it's more focused on their internal political constituencies and the political culture wars that they play.
Yeah.
We're aligning on this issue with Israel and its actions, appeals to the hard right Christian nationalists in the National Caucus,
Right.
the conspiracy theorists that New Zealand First is appealing to, and just some of the political extremists who sit around the cabinet table in the ACT Party. I think it's actually about the constituency that they're reaching into New Zealand,
Right.
and the kind of cultural signalling on this issue.
Because it's weird, isn't it, that for the alt-right, anti-trans, anti-vaccine, pro-Israel seems to be like welded all together as one big cultural omelette.
Which actually makes it even more despicable, because it's not actually, you could disagree with the position of aligning with the United States, but you could understand that maybe the government was making a quote-unquote rational geopolitical decision to do that. I think this is more about
You think it's more venal,
internal, domestic politics.
Follow-up question. Israel's finance minister recently called for annexing all but 18% of the occupied West Bank. Would our government do anything then if they did that?
Well, not this government. That's pretty apparent. And I just linked to the comment I made before that actually the war crimes and breaches of international law are not even in question now, because they're self-confessed. They're stated on an almost daily basis by the Prime Minister of Israel and his senior ministers. So the fact that there's sort of this debate which is actually ebbing away in terms of whether there is a genocide, because it's increasingly apparent and increasingly acknowledged by the international genocide experts and UN committees. You don't even need to debate the war crimes because they're on record. They're in the speeches and in the stated policy of the Israeli government. It is shameful that our government won't even make a murmur about these matters. We should be standing against them just as we stand against Russian outrages in Ukraine.
Exactly. Riccardo, Israel claims Hamas won't negotiate, but Israel this month launched an attack on Hamas negotiators in Doha in an attempt to kill the entire negotiating team. How is Hamas supposed to negotiate if Israel keep bombing the negotiating teams?
Well, this is once again just another tactic in the Israel playbook of deflecting and not genuinely working towards peace and justice. Israel, over the past few years, has already bombed several sovereign nations and is showing absolutely no sign of caring for international law, the dignity of human peoples, and going back to the earlier point, it is concerning to see the Trump administration backing this.
Yes.
And, when I say alignment with the US, I mean alignment with the values that the Trump administration exudes, which is to serve that Christian nationalist constituency, which is to serve culture wars distractions, which is to ignore international law. And what is concerning is that we have a government that, rather than taking that as a sign of need to act urgently, because the more time we allow for international law to just be blatantly disregarded, the more that puts global safety at risk. And what we are seeing are nations like New Zealand that can play a big role internationally when it comes to diplomacy, now sitting on the sidelines and thinking that this is an issue that can be reduced to two-sidism, when there's clearly a genocide on one side that is being committed upon a specific group of people. And so we've got to recognize that our government does have a role to play and that Israel has absolutely no respect for international law.
Michael, it is righteous that Anglican priests are chaining themselves to politicians' doors following this decision. How can we even remotely pretend to be a moral nation in the wake of this appalling decision?
Well, shout out to my old friend Paul Fletcher, who was one of the priests in Wellington, who
good people doing amazing stuff.
Good people who are prepared to put themselves, their bodies on the line for something that they
because this is
really
a moral issue, eh?
It is a moral issue. It's a moral issue. It's a matter of international law, and it's also a matter of a rational solution to decades and decades of bloodshed, because one of the tragedies of this is that, what is the long-term consequences of a genocide committed against a people?
Yeah.
It is more bitterness, it is more hate,
Right.
it is a thirst for vengeance and pushing back. Of course it would be. So you're setting up the next cycle. This is an issue around how New Zealand does position itself as well. I remember in 2003, one of my proudest moments in the 25 plus years of which I've been associated with the Labour Party was when the Clark Labour government had the guts to stand up and say, we won't take part in an unjust,
Amen.
immoral, foolish war
Absolutely.
in Iraq.
Absolutely.
These things do matter.
They do.
And they're remembered by people around the world. What we have done this week will be remembered. Next year, we intend to turn that around so that we're remembered for the right reasons.
Quick round to both of you. David Seymour has built an illegal settlement on the Prime Minister's balls, and we have to pretend that's an independent foreign policy. How much of this is about appeasing Trump, and how much of it is about the weakness of the Prime Minister? Riccardo?
What I will say is that it sounds to me like David Seymour would have supported South Africa's apartheid if he was a politician back then, based on his actions right now.
Totally.
Well,
Michael?
Weakest Prime Minister in New Zealand's history by a long shot. David Seymour's utterly dismissive comments about Luxon earlier this week tell you everything that you need to know there. Of course, in MMP politics, you have parties with different views, but on important issues like this, particularly issues of our international reputation, to have a Prime Minister who just clearly is just sort of this, cold milk in a saucer with no influence over the situation, is just utterly pathetic.
Final quick round to both of you. Israel are now threatening to send their deputy foreign minister to New Zealand in October to thank New Zealand for our stance. Will this be a red flag to a bull in terms of counter-protests, Riccardo?
Oh, I think our government should absolutely reject any form of visit, and I hope that that politician knows that they'll be met with protests and the people of New Zealand standing up against what Israel's government stands for.
Michael, I mean, they want to send her here next month as a thank you. Come on, that's just beyond the pale, isn't it?
Well, the government needs to wear the consequences of its actions. And look, what I was encouraged by on that enormous march down Queen Street a couple of weeks ago was the breadth of Kiwis who were there.
Yes.
There are people who have protested for years
Sure.
and years. Every
We've all been
second
there.
weekend.
But it's the cross-section,
There were people who have never been out
Yeah.
protesting, who just feel moved by this issue, by the scenes of men, women and children being murdered day on day with an inadequate international reaction. And I think more and more Kiwis will come out and have their say, given the government's stance on this.
Awesome. Comrades, we need to move on to issue 2 tonight, and that is the incredible meltdown in confidence by the country's CEOs towards this government. Michael, the CEOs have turned viciously on the Prime Minister and Finance Minister. Why does that matter?
It matters because Luxon at least thinks that these are his people.
Right.
His, corporate speak and tough guy backslapping, the whole shtick that is a part of his political persona and how he presents itself is based on the fact that he understands corporate New Zealand.
That's how he was sold to us, right? That's how he was sold to us. Yeah.
And so when you lose the people that you just sort of attracted at the last election and got you over the line, that sometimes happens in politics. When your base starts fleeing from you, that's a real worry. And look, in this case, what does it come down to? It's Luxon's failed leadership, but it's the fact that this guy and this government have crashed the economy. And these people, they see it. Their bonuses are linked to it. Their boards ask questions about what's happening in terms of the performance of their companies.
Yeah.
And every sector of the economy at the moment is flatlining, less than flatlining, because this government has driven it into the ground, because it's withdrawn demand, because it's collapsed the construction sector, because it's set no direction in terms of the productive economy, because it's crashed infrastructure. And when you talk to these people, they're pretty blunt with you. About just the lack of leadership that they're seeing at the moment. I think a huge worrying sign for the government. As Chris Hipkins said before, there's still, we in Labour recognise there is real work that we've got to do to put the program together for next year. But I think increasingly people see that this government's going nowhere.
Follow-up question. If you look at the growth predictions, we aren't seeing any meaningful growth until 2027. if CEOs are angry with the government now, will it get much worse in the election year if the economy continues to tank?
I'm not actually worried about CEOs being angry. I'd like to see a mood of the smoko room survey, because actually the people who are suffering are working people at the moment who are losing their jobs, seeing their company shut down, seeing their hours cut, seeing their pay cut, living with uncertainty. Now, in my community, Mount Roskill, across the road from me, there are hectares and hectares of fenced-off, empty land that once had public homes on it.
That's right.
That were demolished just before the election,
Yeah.
with a commitment to rebuild them under the previous government.
Yeah.
2 years later, that land is sitting fallow. It's just wasteland for rats and feral cats.
Why?
So you've lost the houses that our families need.
Yeah.
And residential construction in Auckland has crashed, with massive flow-ons to all the support industries. So not only have you started to unpick what we needed in terms of building homes, you have crashed an entire sector of the economy, and that has rippled across the Auckland economy.
What does that
And that's
do?
a real example of this government's foolish decision-making.
What does that do at a community level, though? Having that kind of disruption to the community, how does that impact the community?
So in my community, this is my neighbourhood, but there are also other neighbourhoods around Mount Roskill and Auckland. It's like living in a wasteland. Half the street is not there. People who were important in terms of social capital in that community, who helped out others, who worked out problems, who talked to a kid down the road who was, getting into trouble, they're gone. They're moved out. There's a lack of vitality.
Yeah.
You get illegal dumping, of course, when you have empty sections, and other stuff starts to happen around these sites. So it's been hugely damaging. And that sat there for 2 years, huge parts of Mount Roskill and other parts of Auckland.
Unbelievable.
And, of course, not a dicky bird from the local National MP.
Riccardo, an energy boss, was quoted saying, and I quote, "The government is ineffective. There is no compelling leadership and strategic plan evident that will turn New Zealand around. The Prime Minister doesn't resonate, and bold decisions are required." If that's what the CEOs are saying, what are your thoughts?
Well, it's no surprise that this is what we're hearing. What the government did effectively was a manufactured recession. They cut spending, cut jobs, effectively left people in many ways worse off. And that means people are not being able to spend money in their local retail shops, at the cafes, etc. And we've got a government that has actively contracted the economy by actually punishing some of our most vulnerable communities.
Yeah.
And so, we had a government who promised us the rockstar economy through trickle-down economics that we know didn't work in the 80s. We know that if you give $1 billion of dollars to landlords, if you give hundreds of millions of dollars to the fossil fuel companies, that money doesn't trickle down to everyday people. And so it is absolutely no surprise that we're not just seeing more people lining up at food banks, that we're not just seeing more people struggling to make ends meet, but that also many of the CEOs who were promised the so-called rockstar economy are not seeing those gains because the government just simply chose to contract the economy by cutting jobs, by cutting important projects, including some of the projects that provide essential support systems for people in state care, for people experiencing violence. And so, no surprise. I just want to remind people that there are far more many of us ordinary workers who can vote than there are CEOs. And so if you're feeling the pinch, next year is the time to actually, really score those ministers by casting a vote to make sure that we have a one-term government and not let them continue with savaging everyday people and the economy.
Amen. Follow-up question. 43% said Willis's growth agenda was not appropriately positioned to lift New Zealand's economy in 2025. And that survey, remember, was taken before the shock 0.9% GDP drop. How much trouble do you think the New Zealand economy is in?
Well, Michael alluded to the fact that right now we continue having an economy and the government has no real plans to change this. That is basically just a housing market with some bits tacked onto it. And that is not a productive economy. That is an economy that effectively serves people who have got the wealth to purchase multiple properties. And when we talk about growth, we also got to talk about what kind of growth do we want and who is benefiting from it. You could have GDP growing while at the same time inequality increasing. And this government is hoping to see growth from wealthy millionaires and billionaires pouring money into things like the housing market, as opposed to protecting our manufacturing sector, as opposed to ensuring that we have good jobs for everybody. And that in and of itself, increasing the spending power that we have, which in and of itself can lead to economic growth. And so we've got to always ask ourselves, who is this economic growth for? And right now, for this current lot, it's economic growth for the people who are already doing it really well off.
Quick round to both of you. One chairperson at the conference said, and I quote, "Luxon has been a disappointment. The public don't like him. It's too late for him. He needs to stand aside or be removed by his colleagues. Otherwise, we will end up with the completely loony tune of Labour, with the very left Greens and radical Māori Party. God help New Zealand." Your thoughts, Michael? I mean, they are going to do everything they can to ensure that a left-wing government that is serious about solving problems doesn't get in, right?
Well, of course, the last centre-left government that we had left New Zealand with a growing economy,
right?
New
Exactly.
Zealand with low unemployment.
Yeah.
The reality is that we have to put out our own program, our own plans, our own policies, and have confidence in that. We'll continue to have people like that who see the solution to the current woes that we have as more cuts, more austerity. Less of the public sphere. That group of people are always there. Mr. Hooton, who's deeply critical of this government, is of course one of those people. So people shouldn't be sucked into the criticism that some of these people are making, because actually they want something that's worse and more austere.
Way worse. That's right.
That's right. So we need to build up our own credible progressive program that's about building growth and wealth from the ground up. When you think about that economy, you think about what it actually really is. Think about a couple who've got a couple of kids. They're trying to pay the rent or the mortgage. Their wages have been cut back. They're worried about work, so they're spending a little bit less each week at the local takeaway store. They're putting off that appliance purchase. That flows on to that small business. They employ fewer people, so those people are impacted. That's the kind of doom loop that we're in under this government. And it needs a government that's actually prepared to invest in people, in infrastructure, and positive change to start turning that round, and that's what we will offer next year.
Riccardo, even when you help these buggers, they still want to burn down the left from getting in power.
Like, I'm not that concerned about what a few greedy CEOs have to say over the future of our economy, because listening to them doesn't seem to have worked. But, to the point around putting a good progressive agenda to ensure that we can create jobs and lift people out of poverty. This is what we're not waiting for National or Labour, for that matter, to offer those solutions. That's why we're putting our energy into campaigning for and offering alternatives, like a green ministry of works that will create tens of thousands of jobs in the construction manufacturing sector.
Brilliant idea.
This is why we're fighting to not just change this government, but change politics to one that actually serves everyday people. And this is why we've been unapologetic about, taxing wealth, and that means probably taxing quite a few of the CEOs who were speaking out against the government and the alternative, and to invest that in things like healthcare, into a better welfare system, into public housing, and into good jobs. The time is now to actually stop listening to greedy CEOs who want to keep the status quo, and to the Luxon government, who just seems to care about continuing the economy as it is, despite it clearly not working. And so, we're not waiting around for the CEOs or the Luxon government to offer those solutions. We're fighting to basically change the system.
Preach. Comrades, we need to move on to issue 3 tonight, and that is the ridiculous decision to reopen oil and gas exploration. Riccardo, this government have reopened gas and oil exploration at the same time as they are looking to sideline the Climate Change Commission from emissions reductions advice. This government isn't just in denial over climate change, they're in an alternate reality where it doesn't seem to exist. How have things gotten this bad environmentally in only 2 years?
Look, a lot of this discourse is also a distraction, because it will take 16 years from basically the exploration to production for some of these projects to actually come into effect. And so this is a government that is also taking voters to fools by implying that effectively, by repealing this ban, we'll suddenly have a huge outpouring of available gas and oil in our energy sector. Instead, what we could be doing is adequate investment into renewables. And by that, I mean, looking at investment into solarizing our schools, solar panels in Amarae, and hospitals and in public housing more broadly to lower energy bills across the country and to tackle the greed of gentailers who are continuing to make a huge profit while families struggle. This is where the energy should be put into, not this climate denialist culture war distraction that the government is peddling. And so this is why in the Greens, we're not just committed to reinstating that ban, but actually putting forward solutions that will lower electricity bills and make life better for everyday people, because the repealing of the ban won't lower your energy bills, certainly not at least in the next 16 years. And even then, that's not a guarantee at all.
Exactly.
And people need relief right now, none of this distraction politics that we're seeing from the government.
Michael, Taranaki's Tui oil field was abandoned in 2019 after its Malaysian owner went bust, costing taxpayers a total $293 million to clean up. As part of opening up oil and gas exploration, Shane Jones removed the safeguards Labor put in place to ensure those who make the pollution are forced to bloody clean it up. Why shouldn't oil and gas companies who pollute be made to clean up the cost?
Well, it's corporate welfare of the kind that, the great principled libertarian David Seymour would normally be making a lot of noise about, but has quietly gone along with. Look, our union represents workers, men and women, who are losing their jobs right now because of high energy costs in New Zealand.
Yeah.
This will do nothing to help any worker in New Zealand or any business in New Zealand that is struggling with these issues. As Riccardo said, even if there was a great big find of new oil and gas tomorrow, that's about what we're looking at. And remember this as well, that the ban that Labor put in place was on new offshore exploration.
Yes.
So there is still capacity to explore offshore.
Yes.
And every other block. There is still capacity to explore onshore. Yet since 2014, there has hardly been anything happening in that sector because it's uneconomic.
Yeah.
And actually, if you're a smart capitalist in the energy sector wanting to put your capital into some sort of energy investment around the world, are you going to put it into super heavy capital intensive oil and gas that is hugely polluting, creates huge problems for our environment, is extremely expensive to remediate and set up? Or are you going to put it into energy sources that are renewable, generally cheaper to generate, and that people actually want?
Exactly.
So actually the only people that are beating this drum are the culture warriors like Shane Jones, and it won't do a damn thing.
Quick round to both of you. Chevron, State Oil, Petrobras and OMV all handed back their exploration licenses because they found nothing out there. Shane Jones has more chance of finding a mower than new oil and gas, doesn't he, Riccardo?
I think it's just peak politics from this government, which is that they would rather distract us with these kind of approaches that don't result in lower bills, that don't result in climate action. And all it does instead is just hand money to and resources to a very few industries that will actually not be seeing much economic benefit from the government's policies. Again, if the government was serious about lowering electricity bills, they would be putting more energy into tackling the gentailers as well as solarizing our public infrastructure to lower electricity bills as well. That's where the solutions lie, and it just shows that this isn't a government that is serious about addressing the cost of living crisis, let alone the climate crisis, which they don't even believe in.
Michael, where are they going to find this oil and bloody gas that the experts, the actual companies that are going out there looking for, they all returned the licenses and nothing out here, bro. Nothing out here. Where is it?
Well, some time ago, the term virtue signalling was set up to criticise the left for some of the positions that it took, which were, supposedly more about style than substance.
Yeah.
That's all that this is. This is the politics of virtue signalling. It's about Shane Jones and other ministers being able to cosplay, putting on a high-vis vest and a hard hat.
Exactly.
And look like they're the people out there who are doing something to try and generate jobs and incomes for people when it will do absolutely nothing of the sort. Worse than that, what this announcement has actually done has been to scare off investment in offshore wind, which actually has the potential in New Zealand to provide some of that long-term, sustainable, clean energy at a much cheaper rate for businesses and households.
God, it gets me angry. Comrades, we need to move on to our final issue tonight, and that is the local elections and the current attempt at voter suppression by this government wanting to ban special votes for 2 weeks before Election Day. Riccardo, the Select Committee into ending special voting has been damning of this as little more than voter suppression and gerrymandering. when so many are already sceptical of democracy, how dangerous is it to allow the right to impose rules that purposely damage the left? 73% specials go left.
Yeah, I said through some of the submissions in the Select Committee on the bill that will effectively cut tens of thousands of people from being able to cast a vote by the looks of it. And the challenge that we have is that the government has painted all of this as though making sure that we can counter votes in a timely manner. But the Electoral Commission and others have shown us that actually this is not what's going to happen under the bill in front of us. What will happen is it will make it harder for people to be able to vote, and particularly people who are working multiple jobs, people who may be looking after a sick relative, people who may be transient and moving through multiple addresses.
Right.
And the very same people who us politicians haven't given yet a reason to have hope about politics and the future that we could be representing. And so, again, it's really concerning to see a government that is quite happy to spend its time literally disenfranchising people in this country from participating in our democracy. It just feels like this is yet another copycat move imported from the Trump administration. And democracy is something that needs to be constantly protected, constantly resourced, and not taken for granted, because our ancestors fought hard to actually have a system that is democratic, and it needs to be constantly improved upon. It shouldn't be allowed to simply be eroded away by a government that just simply does not like people who may be working multiple jobs and may not have the ability or the time to enroll in the timeframes that they want to give them. Any move that erodes people's ability to cast a vote should be challenged and should be rejected. And I'm really, really concerned about this bill.
Amen. Thank you for that. Michael, since we privatised local elections to two private companies, participation rates went from 55% in the 1990s to less than 37% now. Isn't it time to take back local elections and run them by the public, for the public? Look, bless those two independent companies, but they don't give a shit about the participation rates. They want the contract dollar, right? And if doing as little as possible gets them that money, that's the free market, isn't it?
I've always thought it's pretty balmy to have this pretty core function of our local democracy
subcontracted
outsourced.
out.
It seems to me to be a basic public service that should be run that way, with a focus on increasing participation. I will say I think that there are broader reasons why participation is low in local government. It's not just that part of the electoral system. Having postal ballots full stop in 2025 as the main way of participating makes it difficult and is a barrier. My 17-year-old who'll be voting next year has never posted a letter in his life. So we've got to look at the broader range of things as well. And
we only had last election in Auckland, last election, there were only 11 special booths that were open for you to enroll. For a city of over 1 million, 11 booths. It's like gerrymandering on an Alabama scale.
So it's got to be properly resourced as well, and we've got to do the work to give people an understanding of why local government really matters. So folks, please get out the 11th of October.
Yes.
It is the last day for voting. It's coming up, and it really, really matters. And
your partner, Julie Ferry, standing?
Yeah, my
love her dearly.
My wonderful wife, Julie Ferry, and Alvin Eden Pukitapa, both from the City Vision candidates.
Does amazing work, deserves people's support.
I'm biased, but she's one of the hardest working councillors you'll ever get out there. And if I can just say on the other point, David Seymour called 100,000 New Zealanders drop kicks because they enrolled in the last few weeks of the last election, and about 300,000 more because they changed their details. As a unionist, I just see that as an organising opportunity. We need to go out next year and tell New Zealanders that this lot are trying to take your vote away.
Yes.
Don't let them do it this time, and don't give them another chance to diminish your rights.
Preach. Comrades, we need to wrap the show with a final word tonight. Riccardo, your final word this week, please, sir.
Despite what the government is saying, not only can we actually ensure that Palestinian people get the justice that they deserve, but that we next year change the government to one that is prioritizing the well-being of everyday people, our natural environment, and tackles greedy wealth accumulation. I think people are feeling the pinch, and we deserve far better than imported culture wars and distractions. And we need a government that is genuinely serious about addressing the cost of living crisis. I look forward to seeing some of your viewers at the next upcoming rallies for Palestine, and particularly when we do get to march over the Harbour Bridge in the next few weeks.
Respect. Thank you, Riccardo. Michael, your final word this week, please.
You know, I'm so proud of the working women and men of this country who have stood up again and again and again for pay equity in the face of the attacks that this government has launched against them and their legitimate rights, of the thousands of people who marched for pay equity last week, and of the Auckland City librarians who won pay equity from Auckland Council this week.
Yes.
And that is what working people do, even in the face of a government like this, is they keep going. They organise, they don't lose hope, and when we do that, we can win. Even in the face of this government's appalling attacks, we're getting those little wins along the way, and with a change of government next year, we can get even more.
Amen. Thank you, comrades. Now to my final word this week. Brothers and sisters, I know that many of you are working your fingers to the bone, and many of you feel that you're going backwards. I know crime is real, and the fear of it in some neighbourhoods as the cost of living crisis makes desperate people more dangerous, opens us up to tough on crime rhetoric, and I know that many feel alienated by liberal concepts of identity that seem imposing or scary. But my dear fellow comrades, your enemy is not a Māori wanting the treaty honoured, it's not a kid transitioning, it's not the exploited migrant worker, and it's not the environmentalist or the feminist. Your enemy is who your enemy has always been. The greedy, venal banks, the big polluters who lie about their pollution, the billionaire class with their alt-right culture war bullshit. Your enemy is the social media hate algorithms that pit us against each other. Your enemy is the politician that strangles the common good for their donors' interests. Your enemy is who it has always been. The 1% richest plus their 9% enablers, and the millisecond the 90% rest of us realise that, their rule of cruelty ends at the ballot box. In solidarity, the revolution continues. Ka pai Aotearoa.
The Bradbury Group, New Zealand's best weekly political argument. The Bradbury Group is an independent podcast through the Rover Network, sponsored by Wātea News. After the show, the Bradbury Group enjoys convivial